I collapsed during Christmas dinner. The ambulance called my son, but my daughter-in-law whispered, "Let her go. She's lived enough." 1 week later, I returned home. That night, she found a letter on the table that drained the color from her face. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
From that Christmas dinner that changed everything, the dining room at Michael's house looked perfect, as always. Nicole had outdone herself with the decorations, white and gold everything, crystal glasses that caught the light just so, cloth napkins folded into little swans. I sat at the far end of the table, the seat she always gave me now, far from the center of conversation. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when I would have been beside Michael, helping serve, making sure everyone had enough to eat. But somewhere along the way, I'd become more of a guest than family. A guest who wasn't particularly wanted. I should have seen the signs earlier. The way Nicole would stiffen whenever I offered to help in the kitchen. How she'd redirect conversations when I started telling stories about Michael as a child. The subtle way she'd move between us when I tried to hug my son goodbye. Small things that I told myself were just her way. Her personality. I made excuses because I loved my son, and I wanted to keep the peace. The turkey was dry, but I didn't say anything. Nicole was proud of her cooking, though she'd never asked for any of my recipes. When I'd offered to teach her how to make Michael's favorite stuffing, the one his father had loved so much, she'd smiled that tight smile and said she preferred to do things her own way. Modern way, she'd added, as if my way was somehow outdated, irrelevant. I was cutting my green beans when the room started spinning. Not dramatically at first, just a gentle tilting, like being on a boat in calm waters. I set down my fork and tried to focus on Michael's voice as he talked about his promotion at work. When had he gotten a promotion? Why didn't I know about this? I wanted to ask, but the words felt heavy in my mouth. "Mom, are you okay?" Michael's voice seemed to come from very far away. I tried to answer, tried to tell him that I was just tired, that I'd been having trouble sleeping lately, but instead of words, the room began to spin faster, and the Christmas lights blurred into streaks of color. I felt myself sliding sideways in my chair, heard the crash of my water glass hitting the floor. The next few minutes were a jumble of voices and movement. Michael was beside me, his hand on my shoulder, asking if I could hear him. But it was Nicole's voice that cut through the confusion. Nicole's voice that would haunt me for days afterward. "Should I call 911? Someone asked. Maybe it was Michael's friend Tom who'd been talking about his new car just moments before. "Yes, call them now," Michael said, his voice tight with worry. But then I heard Nicole, speaking in that low tone she used when she thought no one was listening. She was close enough that I could smell her perfume, that expensive scent she always wore. Close enough that her words reached me even through the fog that was settling over my mind. "Let her go," she whispered. "She's lived enough." The words hit me harder than the physical collapse had. Let her go. She's lived enough. As if I were a burden that everyone would be relieved to lose. As if my 71 years on this earth had been quite sufficient, thank you, and it was time to clear the table for the next course. I wanted to open my eyes, wanted to sit up and confront her, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The paramedics arrived and I felt myself being lifted, moved, questioned. They asked about medications, about pain, about my medical history. Michael rode with me in the ambulance, holding my hand and telling me everything would be okay. But Nicole's words rode with me too. Let her go. She's lived enough. At the hospital, they ran tests and monitored my blood pressure, which had spiked dangerously high. The doctor, a kind woman about Nicole's age, explained that I'd had what she called a hypertensive crisis, likely brought on by stress and fatigue. Nothing life-threatening, she assured Michael when he arrived looking panicked and disheveled. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked, and I heard genuine concern in his voice. It comforted me to know that he still cared, even if his wife had written me off. "She'll be fine," the doctor said. "But she needs rest. Real rest. Has she been under any particular stress lately?" I wanted to laugh at the question, but I was too tired. Stress? Where would I even begin? The loneliness that had been growing for months? The feeling that I'd become invisible in my own son's life? The way Nicole had gradually taken over every family decision? every holiday tradition, every conversation? Michael looked uncomfortable. Well, she's been living alone since Dad died 2 years ago. Maybe it's been harder on her than we realized. Living alone. As if that were the problem. As if the solution were simply to check on me more often. Maybe hire someone to do my shopping. He didn't understand that the problem wasn't being alone in my house. The problem was being alone in their presence. The nurses were kind, bringing me extra blankets and checking on me throughout the night. One of them, Maria, sat with me when I couldn't sleep. She was about 40, with gentle eyes and a soft way of speaking. "You have a beautiful family," she said, nodding toward the flowers Michael had brought. "Your son seems very devoted." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain that devotion and understanding were two very different things? "It must be nice to have a daughter-in-law who cares so much," Maria continued. "She called earlier to check on visiting hours. Wanted to make sure she didn't tire you out. Called to check on visiting hours. More likely called to make sure she could control when and how long people could see me. But I smiled and nodded, because what else could I do? That first night in the hospital, lying in the narrow bed with machines beeping softly around me, I had time to think. Really think, without the constant background noise of trying to keep everyone happy. Trying not to be a burden. Trying to stay relevant in a family that seemed to have moved on without me. When had it started? When had I stopped being Michael's mother and become just an obligation to be managed? When had my opinion stopped mattering, my presence stopped being welcomed, my love stopped being enough? I thought about the last few months, about Christmas shopping alone for the first time in decades because Nicole preferred to handle the gift-giving herself. About Thanksgiving dinner where I'd offered to bring my famous apple pie and been told that dessert was already handled. About Michael's birthday party where I'd arrived to find I was the only guest over 50. Sitting with people I'd never met while Nicole held court at the other end of the table. Each memory was like a small cut, insignificant on its own, but adding up to a wound that had been bleeding for longer than I'd realized. But it was Nicole's words that kept echoing in my mind. Let her go. She's lived enough. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away even now. How long had she been thinking that? How many times had she looked at me across the dinner table and wished I would simply disappear? And Michael, had he heard her? Had he protested? Or had he simply stood there while his wife dismissed his mother's life as expendable? The questions tormented me through that long first night, and I knew that when I left this hospital, nothing would ever be the same. I couldn't go back to pretending that everything was fine, that the small cruelties and casual dismissals were just misunderstandings. For the first time in years, I was going to have to decide what I wanted my life to look like. And for the first time in years, I was going to have to fight for it. The next morning brought a parade of doctors with clipboards and concerned expressions. My blood pressure had stabilized overnight, but they wanted to keep me for observation. Doctor. Martinez, the woman who'd treated me in the emergency room, pulled up a chair beside my bed. "Helen, I need to ask you some questions about your home situation," she said gently. "Sometimes these episodes can be triggered by environmental factors. Stress, isolation, changes in routine." I nodded, though the word isolation stung more than I expected. Was it that obvious? Could medical professionals see what I'd been trying so hard to hide from myself? "Do you live alone?" "Yes, since my husband passed 2 years ago." "And you have family nearby?" "My son lives about 20 minutes away. He's married, has a successful career." I heard myself reciting the facts like a resume, the way I'd been trained to speak about Michael and Nicole. Always positive, always grateful, never complaining. "Do you see them often?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. How often was often? The stilted dinners where I felt like an outsider. The brief phone calls that Nicole usually cut short with some urgent need for Michael's attention. The holidays where I was included, but not involved. "We have dinner together regularly," I said finally, which was technically true if you considered once every few weeks regular. "Doctor." Martinez made a note on her chart, but I could see she wasn't entirely satisfied with my answers. "Helen, I'm going to be direct with you. Your blood pressure spike was severe. This kind of hypertensive crisis doesn't usually happen in isolation. There's often an underlying stressor, something that's been building for a while. She was right, of course. But how could I explain that the stressor was feeling unwanted by the only family I had left? How could I tell her that my daughter-in-law had wished for my death and my son hadn't even heard her? After Dr. Martinez left, I tried to rest, but the hospital was busy with morning routines. Nurses came and went, checking my vitals, bringing medications, asking how I was feeling. They were kind, these strangers who cared for me with more genuine attention than I'd received from my family in months. Around 11, Michael arrived with a small bouquet of flowers from the hospital gift shop. He looked tired, and I felt a stab of guilt for causing him worry. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" He pulled the visitor's chair closer to my bed, and for a moment, it felt like old times. Just the two of us. No Nicole orchestrating the conversation from the sidelines. "Much better. The doctors say I should be able to go home in a few days." "Good. That's good." He fidgeted with the edge of my blanket. "Mom, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we talked about some changes. Nicole and I were discussing it last night." Of course they were. Nicole was already making plans, deciding what needed to be done about the inconvenient mother-in-law who'd had the audacity to collapse at Christmas dinner. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Well, living alone obviously isn't working out. You're isolated, and we don't see the signs when you're struggling." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Nicole found some really nice assisted living communities. Not nursing homes," he added quickly, seeing my expression. "Independent living, but with support services, meal programs, activities, people your own age, people my own age." As if I'd reached some expiration date where I could only associate with other discards. "I'm not ready for that, Michael." "Mom, be reasonable. You collapsed at dinner. The doctor said it was from stress and isolation. These places are designed to address exactly those issues." I wanted to tell him that my stress wasn't from living alone. It was from feeling alone even when I was with people who were supposed to love me. But how could I explain that without sounding pathetic? "I need some time to think about it." Michael's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it automatically. "Sorry, that's Nicole. She's handling some insurance questions for me." He stood up. "I should get going, but we'll talk more about this when you're feeling better." After he left, I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the small holes in each square. Assisted living. The euphemism made it sound like a choice, like an adventure, but we both knew what it really meant. It meant giving up my independence, my home, my last bit of control over my own life. The afternoon brought a surprise visitor. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, appeared in the doorway with a concerned smile and a container of homemade cookies. "Helen, dear, I heard what happened. How are you feeling?" It struck me then how much more genuine concern I was getting from a neighbor I barely knew than from my own family. Mrs. Patterson and I exchanged pleasantries maybe once a week when we collected our mail. But here she was, bringing cookies and asking about my well-being. "I'm doing much better, thank you. It was very kind of you to come." "Nonsense. We neighbors have to look out for each other." She settled into the chair Michael had vacated. "I brought you some of those oatmeal cookies you mentioned liking. I made extra for the holidays anyway." I'd mentioned liking her cookies? I barely remembered the conversation, but she had remembered, had cared enough to bring them to a hospital. When was the last time Nicole had remembered something I liked? "Has your family been by to see you?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "My son was here earlier. His wife is. She's very busy this time of year." Mrs. Patterson nodded, but there was something in her expression that made me think she understood more than she was letting on. Had she noticed things about my relationship with Nicole? Had other people seen what I'd been trying so hard to ignore? Well, you just focus on getting better. And when you get home, if you need anything, groceries, a ride somewhere, you just let me know. After she left, I found myself crying for the first time since the collapse. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming realization that a virtual stranger had shown me more kindness in 30 minutes than my daughter-in-law had shown me in months. That evening, Nicole finally made an appearance. She arrived during visiting hours with a professional-looking arrangement of flowers and that smile I'd learned to recognize. the one she wore when she was performing for an audience. "Helen, you poor thing. We've all been so worried about you." She set the flowers on the bedside table and leaned down to give me an air kiss that didn't quite touch my cheek. "Thank you for the flowers. They're beautiful. I wanted to come sooner, but I've been coordinating with the doctors about your care plan, making sure all your needs are being addressed." She pulled out a small notebook. "I've been researching those senior communities Michael mentioned. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what's available." Senior communities. Not assisted living anymore, but senior communities. The language kept evolving, but the message remained the same. I needed to be relocated, managed, contained. "Nicole, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to leave my home." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Helen, darling, sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for our own good. This episode was a wake-up call. You can't keep living in denial about your limitations." My limitations. As if wanting to stay in my own home was some kind of character flaw. "The doctor said I'll be fine with some lifestyle changes. Better stress management, regular checkups. Doctors have to be optimistic, Helen. They can't tell you that living alone at your age is a recipe for disaster. But we can see the writing on the wall." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Michael is beside himself with worry. He blames himself for not seeing the signs sooner." There it was, the subtle manipulation, making me responsible for Michael's emotional state, making my desire for independence into a selfish act that hurt my son. "I don't want to be a burden," I said quietly. "Of course you don't. That's why we need to be proactive about this. The communities I've found are lovely. You'd have your own apartment, but with meal service, housekeeping, activities, you'd be around people who understand what you're going through. People who understand what I'm going through. As if aging were a disease that required quarantine with other sufferers. I'd like to see the information when I get home." "Absolutely. I've already scheduled some tours for next week. We can make a day of it, maybe have lunch afterward." She stayed for exactly 20 minutes, long enough to be seen by the nursing staff as a caring daughter-in-law, but not long enough for any real conversation. Before she left, she hugged me goodbye, and I caught her whispering something to the nurse at the station. After she was gone, I asked Maria, the night nurse who'd been so kind, what Nicole had said. Maria hesitated, then sat on the edge of my bed. "She was asking about your mental state, whether you seemed confused or difficult to manage." The words hit me like ice water. Nicole was already building a case, creating a narrative where I was becoming incompetent, difficult, a problem that needed professional management. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her you seemed perfectly lucid and pleasant to me." "Helen?" Maria paused. "Can I ask you something? Do you feel safe at home? Do you feel supported by your family?" The question caught me off guard. Safe? Supported? I'd never thought about it in those terms before. I'd focused so much on not being a burden that I'd never considered whether my family was actually helping or hindering my well-being. I don't know how to answer that." Maria nodded understandingly. "Sometimes family dynamics can be complicated. If you ever need someone to talk to, the hospital has social workers who specialize in family counseling." That night, I lay awake thinking about Maria's question. Did I feel safe? Supported? The answer, I realized with growing clarity, was no. I felt managed, controlled, and gradually erased, but I didn't feel safe or supported. For the first time, I began to wonder if the problem wasn't my age or my living situation. Maybe the problem was that I'd allowed myself to become so small, so accommodating, that I'd disappeared entirely. Maybe it was time to remember who I used to be before I became someone else's inconvenience. Maybe it was time to take up some space again. Coming home from the hospital should have felt like a relief. 7 days of institutional food, beeping machines, and sleeping in a bed that wasn't mine had made me long for my own space. But as Michael helped me through my front door, something felt wrong immediately. It took me a moment to pinpoint what it was. The house looked the same at first glance, but there were subtle differences that made me feel like a stranger in my own home. The throw pillows on my sofa had been rearranged. The magazines on my coffee table were stacked differently. My reading lamp had been moved to the other side of my favorite chair. Nicole stopped by a few times while you were in the hospital, Michael explained, setting my small overnight bag by the stairs. She wanted to make sure everything was ready for your return. You know how she is about details. I did know how Nicole was about details. She liked things done her way, arranged according to her vision of how life should look. But this was my house, my space, organized the way I'd lived for 43 years. She didn't need to do that, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. She was just trying to help. She thought you might want things a little more accessible. Michael gestured toward the living room. She moved some of your photos to that lower shelf so you wouldn't have to reach for them. I looked where he pointed and felt my heart sink. The photos that had lived on my mantelpiece for decades, pictures of Michael as a baby, my wedding portrait, snapshots of family vacations, had been relocated to a bookshelf at eye level. In their place on the mantel were some generic decorative objects I didn't recognize. Where did these come from? I picked up a ceramic bowl filled with what looked like potpourri. Nicole brought them from home. She thought they'd brighten the place up, as if my memories were somehow too dark, too depressing for display. As if the life I'd lived in this house needed to be improved by someone else's decorative sense. I walked into the kitchen and found more changes. My spice rack had been reorganized alphabetically, which seemed helpful until I realized I'd spent years knowing exactly where everything was by my own system. The magnets on my refrigerator, grandchildren's artwork, appointment reminders, funny cartoons clipped from newspapers, had been removed. In their place was a single magnetized notepad with Nicole's handwriting at the top. Helen's important information. The notepad contained a list of phone numbers. Michael's work, Michael's cell, Nicole's cell, the doctor's office, something called emergency services. At the bottom, in Nicole's neat script, was a medication schedule that matched what the hospital had sent home with me. She made you a medication chart, Michael said, appearing behind me. This way, you won't forget to take anything. I'd been managing my own medications for 71 years. The few prescriptions I took were simple enough that I'd never had trouble remembering them, but apparently Nicole had decided I needed supervision. That was thoughtful, I managed. In the bathroom, I found that my medicine cabinet had been reorganized as well. All the bottles were lined up with their labels facing forward, and there was a plastic pill organizer sitting on the counter with each day of the week clearly marked. It was the kind of thing you saw in nursing homes, designed for people who couldn't be trusted to manage their own health care. But it was my bedroom that revealed the true extent of Nicole's intervention. She'd moved my furniture around, supposedly to make it safer. My nightstand was now on the opposite side of the bed, next to the wall instead of the walkway. When I asked Michael about it, he explained that Nicole thought I'd be less likely to trip in the dark if the path to the bathroom was completely clear. Never mind that I'd been navigating this room in the dark for decades without incident. Never mind that moving my nightstand meant I now had to reach across my body to turn off my reading lamp or grab my water glass. Nicole had decided this arrangement was better, and somehow that was supposed to be the end of the discussion. She also installed this, Michael said, pointing to a motion sensor nightlight that had been plugged into the wall outlet. It'll help you see where you're going if you get up at night. The light was practical, I supposed, but it cast an eerie blue glow across my bedroom floor. It made me feel like I was in a hospital, or worse, like I was an invalid who couldn't be trusted to find her way to the bathroom without artificial assistance. In my closet, I discovered that Nicole had been even busier. She'd gone through my clothes and rearranged everything for easier access. My everyday clothes were now hanging in the front section, while things she deemed too fancy for daily wear had been pushed to the back. She'd also added helpful labels to the shelves: sweaters, blouses, casual pants, labels, in my own closet, as if I might forget what kind of clothes I owned or where I'd been keeping them for the past 40 years. But the most unsettling discovery was in my den, the small room where I kept my desk and important papers. Nicole had clearly spent considerable time here, organizing my filing system. All my documents were now in new folders with printed labels, filed in what she probably considered a more logical system. The problem was, I couldn't find anything. My insurance papers, which I'd always kept in a manila envelope marked health stuff, were now filed under medical insurance in a hanging folder. My bank statements had been moved from the desk drawer where I could easily reach them to a filing cabinet that required me to get down on my knees to access the bottom drawer. Nicole said your filing system was getting a bit chaotic, Michael explained when I mentioned having trouble finding things. She thought this would make everything easier to locate. Easier for whom? I'd known exactly where everything was before Nicole's helpful intervention. Now I felt like a stranger in my own office, unable to find documents I'd filed myself just weeks earlier. The most disturbing part was finding several of my personal letters missing. I'd kept a small box of cards and letters from my late husband, things I occasionally liked to reread when I was missing him particularly badly. The box was still there, but it was noticeably lighter. When I looked through it, I found that the more recent letters were gone, the ones Robert had written during his final illness, when he'd been in and out of the hospital. "Where are the rest of my letters?" I asked Michael. He looked uncomfortable. "Nicole thought some of them might be too sad for you to keep dwelling on. She said reading them might be contributing to your depression." My depression. Another diagnosis from Dr. Nicole, who'd apparently decided that missing my deceased husband was a mental health issue that required her intervention. "Those letters weren't making me depressed, Michael. They were helping me remember your father." "I know, Mom, but Nicole thinks it's healthier to focus on positive memories rather than dwelling on the painful ones." I wanted to scream that Nicole didn't get to decide which of my memories were healthy, which of my possessions were appropriate, or how I should grieve my husband. But I could see from Michael's expression that he genuinely believed his wife was helping me, protecting me from myself. That evening, after Michael left, I sat in my rearranged living room trying to process what had happened. In 7 days, Nicole had essentially redecorated my life according to her vision of what an elderly person's home should look like. She'd removed personal touches, added institutional elements, and reorganized everything according to her idea of logic and safety. But the most unsettling part wasn't what she'd changed. It was the presumption behind the changes. She'd entered my home with a key I'd given her for emergencies and had taken it upon herself to improve my living situation without asking my permission or considering my preferences. When I'd given her that key 2 years ago, after Robert died, it was meant for true emergencies. If I fell and couldn't get to the phone, if there was a fire or a break-in, it wasn't meant to give her license to redecorate my life whenever she decided I needed help. I called Michael that night, intending to address some of the changes diplomatically. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound upset." "I'm just having trouble adjusting to all the changes Nicole made. I can't find anything in my filing system, and some of my personal things seem to be missing." There was a pause, and I could hear muffled conversation in the background. Nicole was coaching him, telling him how to respond to his difficult mother. "Mom, Nicole spent hours organizing your things. She was trying to make your life easier. Maybe you just need time to get used to the new system." But I liked my old system. I knew where everything was. "You say that, but Nicole found important documents just scattered around loose. Your insurance cards weren't even in your wallet. What if you'd had an emergency? Had Nicole gone through my purse as well?" The violation felt overwhelming, but I couldn't figure out how to express it without sounding ungrateful for her help. "I keep my insurance cards in my desk drawer. I've always known where they were." "Mom, be honest. Has keeping track of paperwork been getting harder lately?" There's no shame in accepting help when you need it. There it was again. The suggestion that my resistance to Nicole's changes was evidence of declining mental capacity rather than a reasonable response to having my privacy invaded and my possessions rearranged without permission. After I hung up, I walked through my house again, seeing it with new eyes. Nicole hadn't just reorganized my belongings, she'd reorganized my identity. The personal touches that made this space mine had been systematically removed or minimized. The photos that told the story of my life had been replaced with generic decorations. My filing system, developed over decades to suit my needs, had been replaced with one that suited her sense of logic. I was living in a house that looked like Helen Williams lived there, but felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who needed labels to remember what was in her own closet, motion sensors to navigate her own bedroom, and pill organizers to manage her own health care. For the first time since coming home, I wondered if this was how it started. Not with dramatic declarations or obvious takeovers, but with small kindnesses that gradually stripped away your autonomy. With helpful suggestions that slowly erased your preferences. With organizational improvements that left you feeling like a stranger in your own life. I thought about the assisted living communities Nicole had mentioned, with their helpful staff and organized activities and meal programs. Was this what she was preparing me for? Making my own home feel so institutional that a real institution would seem like a natural progression. Sitting in my rearranged living room, surrounded by changes I'd never requested, I realized that Nicole hadn't just reorganized my house during those 7 days. She'd begun reorganizing me. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came 3 days after I'd been home from the hospital. I was looking for my address book, wanting to call my old friend Dorothy, who lived 2 states away. We'd been Christmas card friends for years, and I thought she might enjoy hearing that I was feeling better after my health scare. The address book wasn't in its usual spot by the phone, so I checked my reorganized desk drawers. When I couldn't find it there either, I called Michael. "Mom, why do you need Dorothy's number? Is everything all right?" "I just wanted to call her, catch up a little. We haven't talked in ages." There was a pause. "Nicole mentioned that some of your old friends might not be the best influence right now. She thinks you should focus on making new connections with people who understand what you're going through. People who understand what I'm going through." That phrase again, as if having high blood pressure was some kind of exotic condition that required a specialized social circle. "What do you mean, not the best influence?" "Well, you know how Dorothy can be. She's always complaining about her health, talking about people who've died. Nicole thinks that kind of negativity might be contributing to your stress levels." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Nicole thinks Dorothy is a bad influence? She's just looking out for your mental health, Mom. Maybe it would be better to focus on more positive relationships right now." After I hung up, I sat staring at the phone for a long time. Dorothy wasn't negative. She was realistic. At our age, people did die. Health did become a concern. We talked about these things because they were part of our reality, not because we were dwelling on the morbid. But more importantly, when had Nicole started monitoring my friendships? When had she appointed herself the guardian of my social life? I decided to call Dorothy anyway, using directory assistance to get her number. The conversation was exactly what I needed. Warm, familiar, comforting. Dorothy had heard about my hospital stay through our mutual friend Ellen, and she was full of concern and encouragement. "You know, Helen, I've been thinking about you a lot lately," she said. "The last few times we've talked, you've seemed a little subdued, like you were holding something back." Had I been holding things back? I thought about our last conversation, trying to remember what I'd shared about my life with Michael and Nicole. "Things have been a bit complicated with my family," I admitted. "Want to talk about it?" So I did. For the first time in months, I found myself telling someone the truth about my situation. About feeling invisible at family gatherings. About Nicole's subtle criticisms. About the way my preferences were consistently overruled. About coming home from the hospital to find my life reorganized without my consent. "Oh, honey," Dorothy said when I finished. "That sounds familiar." Familiar? My daughter-in-law went through a phase like that with my son, always rearranging things for my own good, making decisions about my social life, treating me like I was losing my mind instead of just getting older. What happened? I finally had to put my foot down. Told them both that being 70 didn't make me incompetent, and being concerned didn't give them the right to run my life. She paused. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. After we hung up, I felt both better and worse. Better because someone had understood exactly what I was experiencing. Worse because it meant what I was feeling wasn't just sensitivity or misunderstanding. It was a recognizable pattern of behavior. That afternoon, I decided to test something. I wanted to see if Nicole had been monitoring more than just my living space. I called the library to ask about their book club, something I'd been considering before my hospital stay. "Oh, Mrs. Williams," the librarian said. "Your daughter-in-law called earlier this week asking about our programs. She was concerned that some of our discussion topics might be too stimulating for someone in your condition." My condition. What exactly did she tell you about my condition? Well, she mentioned that you'd had a serious health episode and that your family was being careful about stress factors. She asked us not to contact you about any demanding activities for a while. I thanked the librarian and hung up, my hands shaking with anger. Nicole had called the library. She'd spoken to them about my condition and asked them not to include me in activities. She was systematically cutting me off from normal social interactions, using my health scare as justification. How many other places had she called? How many other people had she spoken to about my supposed limitations? I thought about Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor who'd visited me in the hospital. When was the last time I'd seen her? Had Nicole said something to her as well? I decided to find out. Mrs. Patterson was working in her front garden when I walked over, moving slowly because I was still feeling weak from my hospital stay. Helen, how wonderful to see you up and about. I was wondering how you were doing. I'm feeling much better, thank you. I wanted to thank you again for visiting me in the hospital. It meant a lot. Of course, dear, though I have to say I was surprised when your daughter-in-law called to tell me you wouldn't be up for visitors for a while. The cold feeling in my stomach spread. Nicole called you? She was very polite about it, said you were feeling overwhelmed and needed some quiet time to recover. I certainly understood. Health scares can be exhausting. Mrs. Patterson looked at me more closely. But you seem to be doing quite well now. Did she say anything else? Mrs. Patterson hesitated. She mentioned that you might be feeling a bit confused about some things, and that the family was helping you sort through some decisions about your living situation. She asked me to let her know if I noticed anything concerning about your behavior. I felt like I'd been slapped. Nicole had asked my neighbor to spy on me, to report back if I seemed confused or behaved strangely. She was building a case, creating a network of people who would confirm that I was declining mentally. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that I'm not confused about anything. My mind is perfectly clear. She studied my face carefully. I can see that, dear. And honestly, I was a bit surprised by the phone call. You've always seemed very sharp to me. That evening, I sat down with a notepad and started making a list of all the ways Nicole had been controlling my life since my hospital stay. The picture that emerged was staggering. She'd reorganized my home without permission. She'd removed personal belongings that she deemed inappropriate. She'd told my son that my resistance to her changes was evidence of mental decline. She'd contacted the library to prevent me from joining activities. She'd called my neighbor to establish surveillance and plant seeds of doubt about my mental state. She'd somehow made my closest friend seem like a negative influence. Each item on the list was small enough to be dismissed individually as caring concern. Taken together, they formed a comprehensive plan to isolate me from normal social interactions and support systems while positioning herself as my necessary caretaker. I thought about the assisted living communities she'd mentioned, and suddenly they didn't seem like suggestions anymore. They seemed like destinations in a carefully planned journey that I was being taken on without my consent. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Michael. Mom, Nicole, and I were talking, and we think it might be a good idea for you to see someone. See someone? A therapist? Someone who specializes in helping people adjust to life changes. You've been through a lot lately, and Nicole noticed that you seemed a bit paranoid today when she stopped by to check on you. Nicole had stopped by? I hadn't seen her, but then again, she had a key. Had she been in my house while I was talking to Mrs. Patterson? What do you mean, paranoid? She said you seemed suspicious about the help she's been giving you. Like you thought she had some kind of ulterior motive. Michael's voice was gentle, the tone people use when they're trying to reason with someone they think is losing their grip on reality. I'm not paranoid, Michael. I'm concerned about having my life rearranged without being consulted. See, that's what I mean. You're interpreting Nicole's help as some kind of attack. That's not like you, Mom. You've always been so grateful for family support. Grateful. That was the key word. I was supposed to be grateful for Nicole's interference, thankful for her reorganization of my life, appreciative of her efforts to isolate me from friends and activities. Any resistance on my part was evidence of mental instability rather than reasonable self-advocacy. I think I should have some say in how my own life is organized. Of course you should. But sometimes we need help seeing what's best for us. The therapist could help you work through some of these feelings of resistance, resistance. As if wanting control over my own life was a pathological condition that needed professional treatment. After I hung up, I walked through my house one more time, seeing it now not as a home that had been helpfully reorganized, but as a crime scene where my autonomy had been systematically stolen. Every change Nicole had made, every conversation she'd had about me with other people, every suggestion about my mental state, it was all part of a larger plan to make me dependent on her management. But the most chilling part was how effective it was. Michael genuinely believed his wife was helping me. Mrs. Patterson had been convinced I might need watching. The librarian thought I was too fragile for book discussions. Even I had started to question whether my objections were reasonable or just the complaints of a difficult old woman. Nicole hadn't just been reorganizing my house for the past week. She'd been reorganizing reality itself, creating a version of events where I was declining and she was the devoted daughter-in-law trying to help. Anyone who looked at the situation from the outside would see a caring family managing an elderly woman's transition to a more supervised living situation. But I knew the truth now. This wasn't care, it was a takeover. And if I didn't find a way to stop it soon, I would wake up one morning to find myself in one of those assisted living communities, wondering how I'd gotten there, and why no one had asked what I wanted. The question was, how do you fight back against help? How do you prove you're being controlled when everyone thinks you're being cared for? How do you reclaim your life when the person stealing it has convinced everyone else that they're saving it? I looked at the notepad where I'd written down all of Nicole's interventions, and suddenly I knew what I had to do. If Nicole could build a case against my competence, I could build a case against her interference. If she could create a narrative about my decline, I could create one about her control. But I would have to be very, very careful. Because now I understood what I was really fighting. Not just Nicole's manipulation, but an entire system that was ready to believe that an elderly woman's resistance to help was evidence of the need for more help. The war for my independence was about to begin. I spent the next 3 days planning. Not the kind of planning I'd done for most of my life, grocery lists and holiday menus and doctor's appointments, but strategic planning, the kind of thinking that felt foreign and necessary at the same time. If Nicole was building a case against my competence, I needed to build one against her interference, but I had to be smart about it. One wrong move, one moment that could be interpreted as confusion or paranoia, and she'd have all the ammunition she needed to convince Michael that I really was losing my grip on reality. The first thing I did was start documenting everything. I bought a small notebook and began writing down every interaction, every phone call, every instance where I discovered Nicole had made decisions about my life without consulting me. I dated each entry and wrote in the clearest handwriting I could manage, knowing that someday someone might need to read it and judge my mental state based on what they saw. January 3rd. Discovered Nicole called library to prevent me from joining book club, citing my condition and need to avoid stimulating activities. January 4th. Mrs. Patterson revealed Nicole asked her to monitor my behavior and report anything concerning. January 5th. Michael suggested therapy for my resistance to help. Nicole apparently told him I seemed paranoid about her assistance. The act of writing it down made the pattern even clearer. Nicole wasn't just helping, she was systematically isolating me while positioning herself as my necessary caretaker. Each action was small enough to be defensible, but together they formed a web that was designed to trap me. The second thing I did was start rebuilding the connections Nicole had tried to sever. I called Dorothy back and had several long conversations about my situation. I made a point of talking to Mrs. Patterson every day, demonstrating that I was perfectly lucid and capable. I even went to the library and spoke with the librarian myself, clarifying that I was indeed interested in their programs, despite what my well-meaning daughter-in-law had told them. "I'm so glad you came in," the librarian said. "I have to admit, I was surprised by your daughter-in-law's call. You've always been one of our most engaged patrons. Sometimes family members can be overprotective," I said carefully. "I appreciate their concern, but I'm quite capable of making my own decisions about my activities." The librarian nodded understandingly. "Well, book club meets Thursday evenings if you're interested. We're starting a new novel next week." Each conversation was a small victory. A piece of evidence that I was not the declining, confused woman Nicole was painting me to be. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. Nicole's narrative was compelling because it played into everyone's expectations about aging. People wanted to believe that families were caring for their elderly members, that daughters-in-law were devoted caregivers, that resistance to help was a symptom rather than a reasonable response to overreach. I needed something more dramatic, something that would force everyone to see the situation clearly. That's when I decided to write the letter. It took me 2 days to get it right. I went through several drafts, trying to find the balance between emotional honesty and rational presentation. The letter needed to be devastating enough to wake people up, but measured enough that no one could dismiss it as the rambling of a confused mind. I wrote it by hand, in my clearest script, on good stationery. I dated it and signed it, then made 3 copies, one for Michael, one for my own records, and one that I planned to give to my lawyer. The letter began simply, "To my family and anyone else who may be concerned about my welfare. I am writing this letter to document a situation that has been developing since my recent hospitalization. I want to state clearly, while I am of sound mind and good health, what has been happening to me and why I am deeply concerned about my future independence. On Christmas Day, I collapsed during dinner at my son Michael's house. While waiting for the ambulance, I heard my daughter-in-law Nicole whisper to my son, 'Let her go, she's lived enough.' These words have haunted me not because they revealed Nicole's feelings about my death, but because they revealed her feelings about my life. In her mind, I have already outlived my usefulness." I went on to detail every instance of Nicole's interference, the reorganization of my home without permission, the removal of my personal belongings, the conversations with my neighbors and the library, the attempts to isolate me from friends and activities. I described how my resistance to these changes was being reframed as evidence of mental decline, and how suggestions of therapy and assisted living were being presented as medical necessities rather than lifestyle choices. I want to be absolutely clear about my mental state. I am not confused, paranoid, or unable to make reasonable decisions about my own life. I am a 71-year-old woman who has managed her own affairs successfully for decades and sees no reason to surrender that management to someone who has demonstrated she does not have my best interests at heart. Nicole's actions follow a clear pattern. Isolate me from support systems, position herself as my necessary caretaker, reframe my resistance as evidence of incompetence, and gradually move me toward a living situation where she has complete control over my daily life. I am writing this letter not as a complaint, but as documentation. If anything happens to me, if I am suddenly deemed incompetent, if I am moved to an assisted living facility against my will, if I become unable to advocate for myself, I want there to be a record of what led to that situation. I am not opposed to help when I need it. I am opposed to having my autonomy systematically dismantled by someone who has convinced my family that this dismantling is care. The letter was 3 pages long when I finished it. Reading it over, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because putting it all down on paper made the betrayal even more stark. Relief because finally, I had found a way to tell the truth about what was happening to me. The question was how to deliver it. I knew that if I simply handed it to Michael, Nicole would find a way to dismiss it. She'd say I was having delusions, that writing accusatory letters was evidence of the paranoia she'd already told him about. I needed to be strategic about the timing and the method. That's when I remembered Nicole's key to my house. She'd been using it regularly, coming and going as she pleased to check on me. If I left the letter where she would find it during one of her unauthorized visits, she'd be forced to confront it without the opportunity to prepare her response or coach Michael on how to react. I decided to leave it on my kitchen table, where she would see it immediately if she came inside. But I wanted witnesses to the letter's existence before she found it, so I called Mrs. Patterson and asked if she could come over for coffee. "Of course, dear. I'll bring some of those cookies you liked." When Mrs. Patterson arrived, I showed her the letter. Not to read, that felt too personal, but to see and acknowledge its existence. "I've written something important," I told her. "If anything happens to me, if my family says I'm becoming confused or incompetent, I want you to know that this letter exists and that I was perfectly clear-headed when I wrote it." Mrs. Patterson looked concerned. "Helen, is everything all right? You're worrying me. I hope everything will be all right." but I need someone outside my family to know that I've documented some concerning behavior. Can you do that for me?" She nodded solemnly. "Of course. And Helen, if you ever need anything, if you need someone to call or somewhere to go, you just let me know. After Mrs. Patterson left, I placed the letter in the center of my kitchen table, weighted down with the ceramic bowl Nicole had brought from her house. The irony of using her own decoration to hold my letter of truth felt appropriate. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, while I was in my garden pulling weeds, I heard my front door open and close. Nicole was making another of her unannounced visits, probably to do more organizing or to look for evidence of my alleged mental decline. I stayed outside, continuing to work in the garden where she could see me through the kitchen window. I wanted her to know I was home when she found the letter. I wanted her to know it wasn't an accident. It took about 5 minutes. I heard the kitchen door slam shut with enough force to rattle the windows. Then I heard her car start and the squeal of tires as she backed out of my driveway faster than was safe or legal. My phone rang 20 minutes later. "Mom?" Michael's voice was tight with anger and something else. Confusion, maybe, or fear. "We need to talk. Nicole and I are coming over." "I'll be here," I said calmly. While I waited for them to arrive, I sat in my living room, my rearranged, reorganized, Nicole-approved living room, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of fierce satisfaction. For the first time since Christmas dinner, I had acted instead of reacted. I had taken control of the narrative instead of letting it be written about me. Nicole's car pulled into my driveway 35 minutes later. Through my front window, I could see her and Michael having an intense conversation before they got out. Nicole's face was flushed, and she was gesturing emphatically. Michael looked like a man who was being forced to choose between two versions of reality and didn't like either option. When they rang the doorbell, I took my time answering it. I wanted them to wait. I wanted them to think about what they were going to say and how they were going to say it. When I opened the door, Nicole pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. "We need to discuss this letter," she said, waving the pages in the air. "This is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking I've been worried about." But something had changed in Michael's face. He was looking at me not with pity or concern, but with a new kind of attention. He was seeing me, really seeing me, for the first time in months. "Mom," he said quietly, "is this all true? The things you wrote in the letter?" And for the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt like I had my son's complete attention. The question was whether it would be enough to save me from the future Nicole had been planning for us both. "Mom, is this all true? The things you wrote in the letter?" Michael's question hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I could cross. For months, I'd felt like I was speaking a language he couldn't understand, describing experiences he couldn't see. Now, finally, he was asking me to translate. "Every word," I said simply. Nicole's face had gone from flushed to pale. She clutched my letter in her hands like evidence she wanted to destroy. "Michael, you can't seriously be considering believing this. Look at what she's written. It's paranoid. It's accusatory. It's exactly what I've been trying to tell you about her mental state." But Michael wasn't looking at Nicole. He was looking at me, really looking, and I could see him trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the declining, confused person his wife had been describing. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the living room. "Both of you. Let's go through this point by point." We settled into the furniture Nicole had rearranged. Michael on the sofa, Nicole perched on the edge of the chair she'd moved closer to the wall, for safety, and me in my reading chair with the lamp now on the wrong side. "Let's start with Christmas dinner," I said. "Michael, do you remember what Nicole said while we were waiting for the ambulance?" Michael frowned, thinking. "She was upset, worried about you. She said, 'Let her go. She's lived enough.' Do you remember that?" The silence stretched long enough that I knew he did remember. His face changed, a flicker of recognition and discomfort crossing his features. "She was emotional," he said finally. "People say things when they're scared." "Do they?" I asked quietly. "When someone you love is in crisis, is your first instinct to suggest letting them die?" Nicole stood up abruptly. "I never said that." "You were semi-conscious? You were confused? You misheard something and built this entire fantasy around it." "Mrs. Patterson heard you," I said calmly. She was there helping with the other guests. Would you like me to call her and ask what she remembers? Nicole's face went white. She'd forgotten about the witnesses, the other people who'd been there that night. In her version of events, it had just been family, people she could control the narrative with. Let's move on to the reorganization of my house, I continued. Michael, did I ask Nicole to come into my home while I was in the hospital and rearrange my belongings? She was trying to help, Michael said, but his voice was less certain now. She thought some changes would make things easier for you. Easier for me or easier for her? I walked to my mantelpiece, where my family photos had been replaced with Nicole's decorative objects. These are my wedding pictures, Michael. Photos of you as a baby, pictures of your father. Nicole moved them to a lower shelf and put these bowls in their place. Did she ask me if I wanted my memories relocated? Michael looked at the mantel as if seeing it for the first time. I could see him starting to understand that this wasn't just helpful reorganization, it was the systematic removal of my personal history from the most prominent place in my own home. She also went through my private papers, I continued. She removed letters from your father, letters he wrote to me during his final illness. She decided they were too sad for me to keep. Is that true? Michael asked Nicole. They were upsetting her, Nicole said defensively. Dwelling on painful memories isn't healthy. I was protecting her from reopening old wounds. They weren't your wounds to protect me from, I said firmly. They were my letters, my memories, my choice to make. I walked to my desk, where Nicole's new filing system still made it impossible for me to find anything. She also reorganized my filing system without asking. I can't find important documents in my own office. And she put labels in my closet, as if I might forget what kinds of clothes I own. Michael was looking around the room now with new eyes, seeing not helpful improvements, but invasive changes. I could tell he was starting to understand the difference. But the most concerning part, I continued, was what she did while I was recovering. Nicole called the library and told them I was too fragile for their book club. She called Mrs. Patterson and asked her to monitor my behavior and report anything concerning. She's been building a case that I'm mentally declining, using my own neighbors and community as witnesses. That's not what I was doing, Nicole protested, but her voice had lost its conviction. Then what were you doing? I asked. Why did you need to control who I talked to? What activities I participated in? Which of my belongings I was allowed to keep in my own home? Michael was staring at his wife now, and I could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. Nicole? Is this true? Did you really call the library? I was concerned about her stress levels. The doctor said to avoid anything that might... The doctor said to avoid stress, I interrupted. Being isolated from friends and activities creates stress. Having your life controlled by someone else creates stress. Being treated like an incompetent child in your own home creates stress. The room fell silent. Nicole sat down heavily, the letter still crumpled in her hands. Michael was looking back and forth between us, and I could see him trying to process what he'd just learned. Mom, he said slowly, if all this is true, why didn't you tell me sooner? It was the question I'd been dreading, because the answer revealed my own complicity in what had happened. Because every time I tried to resist, Nicole told you I was being difficult. Every time I objected to something, it became evidence that I was declining mentally. She made my resistance into a symptom. Michael's face crumpled slightly. The therapy suggestion. When Nicole said you seemed paranoid about accepting help, I wasn't paranoid about accepting help. I was concerned about having my autonomy systematically dismantled by someone who had convinced you it was care. Nicole stood up again, her composure finally cracking completely. This is ridiculous. I've done nothing but try to help this family. I've spent hours organizing Helen's things, coordinating her care, making sure she's safe. And this is the thanks I get? Accusations and conspiracy theories? You spent hours reorganizing my life without asking my permission, I said. You removed my belongings, controlled my social interactions, and tried to convince my son that my objections were evidence of mental illness. That's not help, Nicole. That's control. Michael was silent for a long time, processing everything he'd heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and sad. Nicole, some of the things Mom is describing, they do sound like what you've been telling me about her behavior, but now I'm wondering if you had it backwards. What do you mean? You said she was resistant to help, paranoid about your intentions, difficult to manage. But what if she was just trying to maintain control over her own life? Nicole's eyes filled with tears, but they looked more like frustrated anger than genuine remorse. I can't believe you're taking her side. After everything I've done for this family, after all the time I've spent trying to help her what? Michael asked. Help her what, exactly? The question hung in the air, and Nicole couldn't answer it. Because we all knew what the real goal had been, not to help me, but to manage me. Not to support my independence, but to gradually eliminate it until I was dependent enough to be easily relocated to wherever Nicole thought I belonged. I think, I said carefully, that we need to establish some new boundaries. What kind of boundaries? Michael asked. First, I want my key back. Nicole's emergency access to my home is no longer appropriate. Nicole's face hardened. Fine, but don't expect me to come running when you fall and can't get to the phone. I'll take that risk, I said calmly. Second, I want to make my own decisions about my social life, my activities, and my living situation. If I want to join book club, call old friends, or keep my late husband's letters, those are my choices to make. Michael nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. And third, I want an apology. Not for trying to help, but for trying to control. Not for being concerned, but for being invasive. Not for caring about my welfare, but for deciding you knew better than I did what my welfare required. Nicole stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her options. She could apologize, admit she'd overstepped, and try to rebuild the relationship on more respectful terms. Or she could double down, continue to insist that everything she'd done was justified and necessary. She chose to double down. I won't apologize for trying to protect this family from a disaster that you're too stubborn to see coming. When you fall again, when you can't manage your medications, when you get confused and lost, don't expect me to clean up the mess. With that, she walked out of my house, leaving Michael and me sitting in the rearranged living room, surrounded by the evidence of her attempts to reshape my life. Mom, Michael said after we heard her car leave. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't see what was happening. You see it now, I said. That's what matters. Over the next few hours, Michael helped me put my house back the way I wanted it. We moved my photos back to the mantel, rearranged the furniture to my preferences, and removed Nicole's organizational improvements from my personal spaces. It was healing work, reclaiming my environment one small change at a time. What happens now? Michael asked as we worked. Now I live my life, I said simply. I join book club if I want to. I call my friends when I need them. I keep my husband's letters where I can find them. I make my own decisions about my own future. And if you do need help someday, I thought about that question seriously. Then I'll ask for it, and I'll be involved in deciding what that help looks like. The difference between help and control is choice, Michael. As long as I have choices, I can accept help. When someone tries to take my choices away, even with good intentions, it stops being help. 6 months later, I was sitting in my garden, the garden I'd redesigned according to my own preferences, when Mrs. Patterson came over with her weekly offering of cookies and gossip. How are things with your family? She asked, settling into the lawn chair I'd bought specifically for her visits. Better, I said honestly. Michael and I have dinner once a week, just the two of us. Nicole and I maintain a polite distance. She's never apologized, but she's also never again tried to reorganize my life. And how are you feeling? Really feeling? I considered the question, looking around at my reclaimed space. My photos were back where I wanted them. My filing system made sense to me again. My social calendar was full of activities I'd chosen for myself. I was taking a watercolor class, had rejoined book club, and was planning a trip to visit Dorothy. I feel like myself again, I said. For a while there, I was becoming someone else's version of what an elderly woman should be. Someone managed, controlled, gradually diminished until I fit into whatever space they'd decided was appropriate for me. And now? Now I'm Helen Williams, 71 years old, perfectly capable of making my own mistakes and my own choices. I have high blood pressure and creaky knees and probably more years behind me than ahead of me. But they're my years, and I intend to live them on my own terms. Mrs. Patterson raised her coffee cup in a small toast. To living on your own terms. To remembering that growing older doesn't mean growing smaller, I replied. That night, as I sat in my reading chair, positioned exactly where I wanted it, with my lamp on the correct side, I thought about the letter that had changed everything. It was still in my filing system, in a folder labeled Important Documents. Not because I expected to need it again, but because it represented something important. The moment I stopped accepting someone else's definition of what my life should look like. The letter had drained the color from Nicole's face because it contained something she hadn't expected. The truth, clearly stated by someone who refused to be diminished. It had forced everyone to choose between two versions of reality. The one where I was a declining woman who needed management, and the one where I was a competent adult who deserved respect. I was grateful that Michael had chosen correctly. But more importantly, I was grateful that I had finally chosen to fight for myself. Outside my window, the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful, and I was alive to see it, and tomorrow would bring new choices that would be mine to make. That was enough. That was everything.